The effects of man-made climate change are noticeable worldwide, from the melting polar ice caps, to rising sea levels and global temperatures, to the increased frequency of droughts and wildfires, and so on. In the wake of these troubling catastrophes, leading environmentalists from every corner of the globe have posited ways that concerned individuals can potentially reduce their own carbon footprint. These include less controversial measures like buying an electric vehicle and recycling, to more contentious suggestions like eating a vegan diet and having fewer children. This last bit of advice stems from the knowledge that more people exhaust more resources. So naturally, if there were fewer people on Earth, humanity's overall carbon footprint would be decreased. Thus, it stands to reason that the most influential environmental activist of all time is not some random conservationist or eco-friendly politician, but rather a destructive, vengeful 13th century emperor. Welcome back to Historian's Corner, where on today's episode we'll be discussing Genghis Khan, the original eco-warrior. The story of Genghis Khan's birth and early life is shrouded in legend. It's genuinely hard to know what to believe since there are very few contemporaneous accounts of his childhood. And those that do exist, like that contained in the epic saga Secret History of the Mongols, offer many details which are questionable at best. Here's all that we can say with some confidence. Genghis was born into a nomadic Mongol tribe known as the Borshigan clan sometime in the middle of the 12th century. The exact year of his birth is unknown. Scholars have focused on 1167 as the most likely date, while surviving Mongol tests have contested the actual year was 1162. His given name was Temujin, and he was the son of Yasuge, who has been described as a royal member of the Borshigan. One would expect that being the child of the clan leader would endow his early years with certain privileges. But this was emphatically not the case. In fact, when he was 9, Genghis's father was tragically poisoned by a band of Tatars who had an ongoing grudge with Yasuge. He and his mother Hoelun were subsequently abandoned by the remaining Borshigan, forcing them into abject poverty. For many years, Hoelun kept her family alive by subsisting off the land. Nuts, berries, fish, and whatever else they could find sustained them throughout these intense tribulations. For Temujin, it could not have felt like fortune was on his side while he was growing up. But the funny thing about fortune is that it often rears its head when you least expect it. Around the year 1184, Genghis Khan reclaimed a woman named Borte as his wife, the same woman that his father had given him to marry just before he had passed. Sadly, though, this circumstance carried with it some unfortunate consequences. You see, the Merkit people, angry that his father had taken his own wife from one of their tribe, decided to continue the feud by kidnapping Borte. Temujin clearly knew he had little chance of recovering his wife on his own, so instead he elected to leverage his royal connections and request assistance from Togril, a powerful Mongol Khan who had had a long-standing relationship with Yasuge. And despite bringing nothing more to the table than an animal skin and keen persuasive skills, he was able to procure from the family friend a standing army of 20,000 soldiers to help get his wife back. He may not have known it at the time, but this was only the beginning of his meteoric ascent. Temujin spent approximately the next 20 years conquering and uniting the various Mongol tribes across the Eurasian steppe, thereby building the largest and most dominant empire in history by the time he had died. While his massive conquest was no doubt an impressive feat, the methods by which he accomplished it were far from merciful. For example, Genghis recognized that in order to control his domain, he needed to procure the fiercest possible loyalty from his people. Maintaining this allegiance among his subordinates was simple. Temujin continuously cultivated a healthy rapport and culture of trust with his men that motivated them to stick by his side. On the other hand, the emperor-to-be firmly believed that the infidelity of some other people could not simply be reversed. And that's where shadier, more violent methods of control came in handy. Specifically, the successful conquest of tribes began with the systemic slaughter of those that threatened his authority. Aristocrats, tribal leaders, even the elderly and wise. Genghis Khan killed everyone who could have possibly usurped his power before they even got the chance. Not even former allies were spared his fate. Temujin and his troops are said to have abandoned a childhood friend and ally of his, Jamukha, because he posed a risk of replacing him as Khan. Genghis's partnership with Togrul was not to last either, and ended with the latter's murder. In yet another shocking case, Temujin allegedly conquered the Tatars, the same group that had abducted his wife, and proceeded to kill everyone in the tribe that was taller than a cart axle. That left only children, who would presumably grow to forget the traumatic capture of their people, alive to tell the tale. From the easternmost regions of Russia all the way to the Pacific Ocean, Genghis repeated this pattern with practically every nomadic group he encountered. So it's no surprise that the birth of the Mongol Empire carried with it an astronomically high death rate. There are obviously no detailed records available that allow us to calculate the exact number of people killed during Genghis's conquest, but the most conservative estimates place the approximate number at 6 million people, with more expansive figures claiming that number may well be as high as 40 million. To put that into perspective, historians tasked with estimating the death toll of the Holocaust believe the loss of life during that travesty totaled anywhere from 12 to 15 million people. These two events are by no means an apples-to-apples comparison, and yet there is still no denying that Genghis Khan presided over one of the worst reigns of terror in recorded history. But is it possible to put a slightly different spin on Temujin's deadly impact? After all, one of the most popular trends in historical study right now is reconsidering the legacies of certain impactful figures, among them George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So, who's to say we can't do the same thing for Genghis Khan? Is it possible that by killing so many people, Genghis's empire-building endeavors actually had a substantial positive environmental impact? Let's investigate. We should note, first and foremost, that human overpopulation is a highly controversial concept. Proponents of the theory most often point to a litany of measurable events: the displacement of native species, the overconsumption of global supplies, the increased frequency of pandemics, etc., and argue that each is being exacerbated by the human race surpassing Earth's carrying capacity. Critics, on the other hand, have generally asserted either that population control measures in response to these claims produce unethical outcomes, or that the claims themselves are just not true. There is unquestionably more nuance to these arguments than can be captured in such a short amount of time. Nonetheless, it seems fairly intuitive to assume that if there were fewer humans on Earth, the depletion of resources would slow, there would be less air pollution, and thus the worst effects of climate change would be mitigated. So then the question naturally arises: by how much does the population need to decrease? Well, leading scientists who subscribe to this theory have supplied a few guesses of Earth's carrying capacity, which broadly range from 1 to 3 billion people. Humanity is currently sitting just below 8 billion inhabitants. So in order to reach these figures, we'd have to have 5 to 7 billion fewer people on the planet, representing anywhere from a 63% to an 88% decline. It's difficult to imagine such a severe drop-off happening anytime in the near future, barring a mass extinction event. This is not to say, however, that a less significant reduction in population size would not make a difference in terms of mankind's environmental impact. If 20%, 10%, or even 5% of humankind cease to exist tomorrow, our carbon footprint would invariably be lower. Now, back to Genghis Khan. Historians estimate that at the time of his death, the population of the entire world was between 390 and 400 million people. Most of them, 280 million or so, resided within the Eurasian steppe that Temujin had spent the last several decades conquering. Any guesses as to what those numbers would have been had this Mongolian Khan never lived would of course be, well, guesses. Still, over the course of 40 years, Genghis and his army killed at least 2% and possibly up to 10% of all humans alive on Earth at the time. Think about that for a second. That's as many as 40 million souls who never had the chance to pollute the atmosphere by raising cattle or farming crops. 40 million individuals who never live long enough to cut down trees or consume any part of the planet in any way. And perhaps most importantly, 40 million men and women who were not allowed to reproduce. Indeed, In his own unique way, Temujin ensured that humanity collectively had fewer children by ensuring that millions of would-be parents never had kids because they were dead. And if that's not the picture of an eco-warrior, I don't know what is. So what do you think? Were the conquests of Genghis Khan a net positive or negative in the scheme of human history? What effect, if any, do you think his conquests had on climate change? Was he ultimately a better environmentalist than Al Gore? Well, be sure to let us know in the comments. For more historical content, subscribe to our channel. As always, thank you for watching Historian's Corner.